This is why you should always keep your head on a swivel. In 2017, an elderly woman who lived alone thought she saw something moving in her backyard and went to the window to have a look. As she's looking around, a shadowy figure emerges right on the other side of the glass, standing in her backyard. Terrified, she keeps an eye on the figure while calling police, but by the time she hangs up, the figure's gone. When the police arrive, her front door is unlocked, so they go inside and they find her still sitting in front of the window looking for this figure. The police search the backyard, but they don't find anything. When the police go back inside to search the house, they quickly find some large footprints that couldn't have been hers in the room that she was sitting in and all around the first floor. That's when they realized what was going on. She wasn't seeing a shadowy figure in her backyard. She was seeing the reflection of someone in the room with her. This is why you should always sleep with your lights on. In 1991, a man named Christopher Case was found dead in his bathtub, fully clothed in the fetal position. When police interviewed his best friend Sammy, she told them about a very disturbing phone call she got from him the night before he died. On the call, he told her that the previous night he had woken up to what sounded like whispering coming from underneath his bed. When he went to look, he couldn't move. As he laid helplessly, he watched a black figure pull itself out from underneath his bed. Once it was fully upright, it reached down and began choking him until he passed out. The next morning when he came to, he felt his neck and it was swollen and bruised. And then he saw blood on his hands and he saw that there were deep, uniform incisions on each of his fingertips. As he's saying all this to Sammy and telling her how scared he is to go to bed that night, he suddenly stops and he says, "I hear whispering outside my room." Then the phone went dead. This is what they meant when they said, "Don't talk to strangers." In the early 1900s, a 10-year-old boy was playing in the woods when a tall man appeared and asked if he wanted to come back to his cabin for dinner. Totally caught off guard, the boy reluctantly agrees and begins walking. When they get to the cabin, the boy is relieved when he sees Paul, a family friend, sitting on the porch, so the boy happily goes inside. After they eat, the boy says thank you to the strange tall man, says bye to Paul, and then he leaves. He had only walked a few steps when he sees his family, along with Paul, running up the path towards him, frantically asking if he was okay. Confused, the boy says, "I'm just fine," and he looks at Paul and he's like, "Why didn't you tell them I was with you at the cabin?" And he points over his shoulder. Paul glances over the boy's shoulder and then narrows his eyes and says, "You were kidnapped by a cult 3 days ago. No one's seen you." Terrified, the boy turns around to look at the cabin he just came from, and it's gone. All he sees is a dark forest that stretches for miles. This is why you never go to the well on your own. In 1983, a young boy was camping with his family on Roan Mountain in North Carolina when his mom asked him to head on down the path and get some water from the well. When the boy didn't return, his mom went to check on him and he was gone. A massive search party was launched to find him, but with temperatures rapidly dropping and finding no trace of him, the family braced for the worst. Then, miraculously, on the 7th day of the search, the boy shows up on the mountaintop in an area they had already searched, healthy and clean. When they asked the boy, "Where have you been?" he said he had been at the well when a tall, faceless man showed up behind him, scooped him up, and brought him to the top of the mountain where he kept him in his cabin all week. After the boy gave a very detailed description of exactly where this cabin was on the mountain, the police were eager to go find it and confront this guy. But the park superintendent just raised his hand and said, "Guys, it's pointless. I've worked here 40 years. There are no cabins on Roan Mountain." This is why you should never explore abandoned ships. In 2014, the US Navy decided to decommission one of its oldest ships, so it brought it into port to be broken down for scrap. Before workers were allowed to actually start breaking it down, the foreman had to go on board and take pictures of every room. So late one night, the foreman spends about an hour walking through this abandoned ship with a flashlight, taking about 100 pictures. When he was done, he emailed the pictures to his boss, who quickly wrote back, "Who's the guy with the axe?" The foreman had no idea what he was talking about, but he noticed the boss had attached one of the pictures that he had just sent him. When he opened it, he nearly fainted. There, in the bowels of the ship, poking his head around a corner, was a faceless man wielding an axe. The foreman had spent over an hour in this hallway and never heard or saw this guy. The Navy searched the ship and never found this guy. They also reviewed security footage of the only entrance, and he never entered or left the ship. This is why you should never spend the night on Niku Island. In 1937, while on her flight around the world, Amelia Earhart mysteriously vanished over Howland Island in the Pacific Ocean. Despite an enormous search, she was never found. 3 years after her disappearance, a scientist discovered an incomplete skeleton on this tiny, uninhabited island called Niku Island that wasn't too far from Howland Island. It looked like whoever's bones these were, they had been ripped limb from limb. But when the bones were examined, they determined they were not Amelia Earhart's. But in 2017, a forensic anthropologist re-examined the bones and determined they were almost definitely Amelia's. So scientists went to Niku Island and they found freckle cream, something Amelia was famous for using. So the working theory is she crash landed on Niku Island and she fell asleep somewhere on the beach. Then, after smelling her blood, hundreds of 3-foot wide coconut crabs came out of their burrows, swarmed her, and ate her. This is why you should never step foot on the faraway dock. In 1994, an 11-year-old named Mark arrived at summer camp and made his way over to the dining hall where the director was going to talk about the next couple of weeks. The director emphasized that no one was allowed to swim out to the dock located way out in the middle of the lake, although she didn't say why. Mark and the 3 other boys in his cabin were so intrigued by this faraway dock that the next day during lunch, while everyone was eating, they hopped in the lake and started swimming out. When they finally got out to the dock, they were a little bit let down because it looked like any other dock. But they decide to make the best of it, they climb on top and they start playing the game where they all stand on one side until it floods, last one to fall off wins. As the corner sank, they started to hear a scratching sound coming from underneath the dock. Suddenly, hundreds of these big meaty spiders come crawling out through the breaks in the wood and slide down the slanted dock towards the boys, who panic and fall forward, and there's spiders swarming their hair and their face. Turns out the dock was off limits because it was overrun with dock spiders, and the boys flooded their nest. This is why you should always breathe through your nose. In 2009, a Russian man named Artyom Sidorkin started experiencing intense chest pains to the point where he couldn't even stand up. He tried to ignore it, but when he started coughing up blood, he went to the emergency room. They gave him an x-ray, and it revealed a fist-sized tumor growing in his lung. Afterwards, the doctor told Mr. Sidorkin, unfortunately, it looks like cancer. But before they could start removing large chunks of his lung, the doctor needed to do a biopsy to see if it really was cancer. So a terrified Mr. Sidorkin came in a few days later, they performed the biopsy, and the surgeon, as he was looking at the tissue, noticed something. Tucked in the middle of the tissue was a 5-centimeter long fir tree. Mr. Sidorkin was a botanist, and he was a big mouth breather, and at some point while he was working, he managed to inhale a fir tree seed. The doctors told him he didn't have cancer, he had a tree. He was shocked, and he said, "I had no sense that a tree was growing in my lungs." But more than shocked, he was just happy to be cancer-free.